Hi. Before going to video, please subscribe to my channel for more interesting stuff.
Story from r/confession. Episode 4. Posted by u/unlocked. I was once involved with a group of people that murdered an old man. I originally posted this in r/true crime, but someone suggested that I repost here. For my own safety, I'll be keeping some of the details of this story a little vague, but it's mostly the truth, with a few guesses where my memory fails me, as this was around 20 or so years ago. Background: I was homeless on and off between 13 to 16 years old, right around the tail end of the 90s, and had little to no contact with my family. I was a moderately frequent drug user, but at the time of this story, I was mostly into weed and mushrooms, with this story containing my first experience with meth and tweakers. In short, I was a typical 90s teenage dirtbag with little to no moral compass. I've lived most of my life in major metropolitan areas, however my wanderings at this time had led me to a somewhat rural town about 2 hours south of Canada, somewhere around the Pacific Northwest. Through adventures in drug use, I had made a few new friends. Let's call them Jeremy, my closest friend in this group, Karen, my girlfriend, and Tony, a fellow teenage dirtbag. We spent our days figuring out ways to get our hands on some weed, for the most part, which included everything from panhandling to burglary. A couple of times a week, we'd go out and see Jeremy's girlfriend, who was under house arrest. While out there, we'd often roam the neighborhood looking for unlocked cars to rob, shoplift from the local shops, and get drunk on cheap, disgusting wine. Looking at you, Carlo Rossi. One day after an afternoon of minor crime and drugs, we met up with someone I hadn't yet encountered, but who was known to my whole group. Let's call him Garrett. Garrett was the only one of us over 18, which, at the time, provided a certain amount of cool factor, and helped us spend our ill-gotten funds on a small amount of meth. We were all crashing at Karen's house while her parents were out of town, and we all got high, this being my first time. After we were all lit, the bag was empty and Garrett started talking about scoring some more. However, we were all broke. Garrett had a brilliant plan for getting a large chunk of money, quickly. It seems Garrett had a childhood friend whose grandfather lived in the area, and kept a lot of cash on hand as he didn't trust banks. Garrett's plan was to put on masks, grab some knives, and scare the old man into giving us his money. The others were very interested as they wanted to get high, however I was fairly adamantly against it. I won't pretend I had some sort of moral objection, but strong-arm robbery was a bit above anything I'd gotten involved with, and quite frankly, I was scared. Additionally, we hadn't cased the place at all, so we had no information about his neighbors, when people left/returned home, if and when people were likely to visit, etc. Furthermore, the entire plan was concocted in about 15 minutes, so it wasn't exactly an Ocean's 11 setup. Jeremy was going to be the driver, and Garrett and Tony would go in and do the actual robbery. Karen and I were supposed to be lookouts, however for all of the above reasons, I refused to have anything to do with it, and told Karen she shouldn't either, which, surprisingly, she listened to. I tried to talk them into waiting until we could get more info about the guy and the neighbors, but Garrett was dead set on doing it ASAP. I've since inferred he was a serious addict and needed something right now, which explains why he was so gung-ho about the whole thing. My concerns were brushed aside and they started getting ready. 2 t-shirts with sloppily cut eye holes would be the masks, and 2 butcher knives from the block in Karen's kitchen would be the weapons. Jeremy would wait outside with the engine running. They'd go in and scare the guy, get the money, and run back out. A plastic grocery bag was used to collect the cash. So, ridiculously equipped, Jeremy, Tony and Garrett headed out the door and Karen and I settled down to wait. This was just about sundown, and we expected the whole thing, for good or ill, would be over fairly quickly, and Karen assured me we'd be snorting lines in no time. We fooled around for a little bit since we were alone, but being twanked to the moon, I was more interested in talking than fucking, and in retrospect can tell that I was annoying the absolute shit out of her with my verbal diarrhea. 15 minutes turned into 30, and then an hour, with no sign of the guys. The sun went completely down and it was full night. By this point, we were super agitated and kept checking the blinds, in classic tweaker form, anytime we heard anything at all. We turned on some music and were laying on the couch when the door flew open. There in the doorway stood Jeremy, eyes wide and frantic, who burst out, "He killed him, he fucking killed him." Behind him walked Tony, in a daze, and behind him was Garrett, covered in blood. I don't think I'll quite ever forget the look on Garrett's face. Haunted doesn't do it justice. It was the expression of someone who knows he is damned. He walked slowly into the house and went directly into the bathroom and closed the door. We heard the faucet running as he washed the blood off of his hands and face, and we all stood silent, staring at each other. After I recovered from my initial shock, I asked what the actual fuck had happened. Evidently things had unfolded pretty much as intended for the first half of the caper. The old man was appropriately terrified and handed over the money after being roughed up a little. Once the bag was filled and they were almost out the door, the poor bastard said, "It's you, Garrett, isn't it?" Evidently recognizing Garrett's voice as one of his grandson's friends. Well, Garrett panicked, turned around, and stabbed him directly in the chest. 19 times. After the first 14, his knife hand bent, so he took Tony's knife and stabbed him 5 more times, with his hand over the old man's mouth to try to stop his screaming. Finally he slowed, stood up, and grabbed the bag of money. They both fled for the door. Unfortunately, one of the old man's neighbors had evidently come home right around this time. I was never able to get the straight of exactly when he arrived, and saw 2 masked men running out of the house. He shouted at them to stop, then proceeded to jump back into his car and follow them. Jeremy drove like a maniac to lose him, and then drove at random while they tried to figure out what the hell to do next. They finally decided to drive back to where we were and ditch the car several blocks away, trusting to the cover of night to hide the blood all over Garrett. As they told the story, Garrett finished washing himself off and opened the bag of money. If I recall correctly, it was something around 5 or 6 grand. They started splitting up the money, even offering me some, which I declined, horrified that things had turned out this way. If I was able to, I would have run screaming from the place. However, now I was party to a murder, and I didn't think they'd be too excited about someone who knew the details running off to who knows where. I refused the offered cash and tried to calm my twacked out mind down, envisioning cops busting through the door at any moment. The largest amount of money they put into a hollowed out deodorant container, which they then buried in the backyard. Each kept several $100s, and Jeremy agreed to take Tony and Garrett where they wanted to go, and would score some meth to come back and take with Karen and I. The 3 left, and Karen and I settled back into waiting anxiously. Eventually Jeremy returned with a big sack of meth, which we proceeded to get blasted on, and spent the entire night playing cards and checking the windows. It was, without question, the scariest fucking night I'd ever had up to that point. We discussed whether or not the neighbor got the license plate number, if the cops would find the car, once again abandoned several blocks away, and even if Garrett would think about killing all of us to cover his tracks. In the morning, we decided to split up. In reality, they were super annoyed by the edgy twacked version of me and I just wanted to get the fuck away from them. I went to the flop house I was staying at, a bizarre little cult-like family setup that probably deserves its own story, and crashed out for a day. When I woke up, I headed to my local panhandling spot to get the money for some potato wedges, 12 for $1, what a deal, and while I was there, checked a newspaper to see if there was anything there. Sure enough, the murder was front-page material, given the semi-rural nature of the town. Chilled to the core, I walked dazedly around town until late that night before returning to my flophouse. The patriarch of my little household was a worldly, mostly well-meaning gentleman we'll call Clive. Clive knew me pretty well by this point, and was a charismatic individual. He pulled me aside and asked what was wrong late that night, informed me that the cops had come by that day asking about me, and asked if there was anything I'd like to tell him. I spilled everything. Clive listened in silence as I told him what had happened, and at the end of it, shared something with me that none of us had known. As a younger man, he'd spent 7 years in prison for armed robbery. He knew what it was like to be in serious, capital T trouble, and asked only one thing of me: don't kill myself in his house, as there were young kids living there. Again, it was a really, really strange place. I assured him I wouldn't, and we drank coffee and played cards until the sun came up. At about 9 in the morning, the cops showed up again, and this time, I went with them. As it happened, I wasn't the last person to be rounded up. Garrett was still at large. Being a good criminal, I clammed up and said nothing, besides asking them what I was being questioned about. They informed me that I was wanted for question in regards to a murder, and I spent the car ride and waiting room time struggling to control my sphincter. When I was escorted into the interview area, which was just a regular office, not a scary movie interview room, I was asked if there was anything I wanted to tell them. I, of course, said I had no idea why I was there, but I was shaking and sweating like a whore in church and knew they could see it. They decided to offer some information. An old man had been murdered, and they had multiple people in custody, all of whom seemed to think that the plan was my idea. I was so stunned by this I made what was probably a rather comical face, and started shaking a bit more. The interviewer outlined the basic facts that they knew, which were all pretty much on the money, except for the fact that I had been fingered as the mastermind of the operation. They even provided me with a statement from Karen which indicated the whole plan had been mine, and that they hadn't wanted to do it but I had threatened them into compliance, which was pretty ludicrous, as I was the youngest person in the group and a scrawny little white boy. He left me with the statement and a cup of coffee while he went to the bathroom. By this point I was freaking right the fuck out. What the actual fuck? Why had my so-called friends all pointed the finger at me? I slowly began to realize that they all had known each other for much longer than I'd known any of them, and that much of our interactions had involved me bringing weed or cash to share. Was I a sucker? Was this me being used, a chump, and being left out to dry? When the interviewer came back in, he sat down in his desk, looked at me, and just said, "Tell me." I paused, then shakily asked for a soda and a cigarette and was provided both, which was a bit interesting, as I was only 15. I told them that I wasn't prepared to make a statement, but could offer a hypothetical explanation of events, which he said would be acceptable for now. I huddled by the window and, as much as it pains me to admit it, rolled over like a good boy. I told them everything relating to the event itself, the participants, the plan, where it went wrong, and what happened after. The interviewer sat in silence and let me ramble it all out while I blew my smoke out the window. He asked why I didn't try harder to stop them, or go to police after the event. I told him I was, quite simply, afraid of people that had killed a guy. Fortunately for me, they seemed to think my story lined up with what they knew so far, and decided they didn't have enough evidence to charge me at that time. I was told not to leave town, and that it would be wise for me to retain legal advice. I returned home and spent the night smoking a bunch of weed, then went to sleep, trying not to think about it. That night, Garrett was tracked down and arrested at gunpoint, brought back to the station and interrogated. He copped to the murder and told them everything that had happened. Much to my everlasting surprise, he backed my claim that I had been against the entire plan from the beginning, refused to take any money, and generally seemed to want nothing to do with the situation. From what I understand, he referred to me as just a kid who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next day I was called back in, sat down, and told about Garrett's confession. This person, who I'd only met that day, confirmed everything that I had told them, and went out of his way to explain that I was not a willing participant. I've always gotten the sense that he was truly remorseful for what he had done, and didn't want to see anyone else suffer for it. They told me I was free to go for the moment, but that they might have additional questions for me in the future. Later that day I saw a story in the local paper indicating that the culprit had been apprehended and naming him. The article also mentioned that 3 minors were in custody and an unnamed male minor was questioned regarding the incident. A couple of weeks later, I caught a Greyhound out of town, leaving the state and returning to my hometown in another state. I later learned that the police did come back around looking for me, but I was long gone. I was still off the grid for another year or two, and I've never been contacted about the incident since then. I've also never returned to that state. I hope you guys enjoyed my rambling story. It's mostly true as far as I can remember it, other than places where I had to fill in a couple of gaps in my memory and a couple of items that were nudged to blur the trail a bit, in case anyone feels like being a super sleuth and trying to identify when and where this happened. I later became a productive member of society, and am a husband and father with a great career that I've worked hard for. I've always wanted to share the story outside my closest circle of friends, and I feel a little better after doing so. I have quite a few wild stories from my youth as a vagabond, and perhaps I'll post some of those later if anyone finds this interesting. Thanks for reading.
Thanks for watching. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more videos.